It's our joy today to be speaking with Jonathan Frizz. Jonathan Frizz is the visionary founder of the 10 Days of Prayer movement. He also serves on the leadership team of the New England Alliance. And Jonathan is driven to see Jesus receive the answer to his prayer in John 17, let them be one as we are one. Jonathan comes to us today as the author of this text, 10 Days, the unlikely story of a global movement, mourning for the return of Jesus. It's available on Amazon or wherever you buy your books online. Jonathan, we're super glad to be speaking with you today.
So good to be here, Jonathan, and grateful for this opportunity.
Jonathan, if we can dive right in, I'd like to ask, you're a young ministry leader, just barely in your 40s, if I'm not mistaken, and you've written up this story. I devoured it, by the way. I literally couldn't put it down, blew through it in a couple days. Highly recommend it. But why did you decide at this juncture of your life in ministry to commit these stories to paper?
Yeah, I'm not that young anymore. I'm in my 40s now, so kids are getting older. Kids are about to go to college, so uh, life is going by fast. But I always knew I wanted to write a book about this journey, and I had actually started several times, and for whatever reason, didn't feel right. Um, and I was conscious that I wanted enough things to happen to be able to tell a good story. And so, um, it just felt right. One thing that changed, I'll tell you one thing that changed, Jonathan. I always was afraid that I would write a book and then it would just sit on a bookshelf with, thousands of other books and be unread. And I work in a library where there is a bookshelf. And so one day I walked into that library and I was like, I would be really honored if my book sat here. And so that was kind of at that point I was like, something changed inside of me. I'm ready to do this. And that was the day I started writing it. So
Cool, cool. The book is arranged chronologically in two parts. Part one is called Formation, covers the years from 2004, from the founding of 10 Days of Prayer to 2011. And then part two, A Global Movement from 2012 to 2023. Both sections are almost a decade or about a decade. One's a little longer, one's a little shorter. But what happened in the middle of those two parts that made this transition for you in your mind?
so for those who may not know, 10 days is a prayer movement where we invite people to stop everything in
Mhm.
order to
Mhm.
pray. And so to me, the demarcation was really those first years, the years leading up to getting the vision and then doing it. It was more about experimenting and what we were doing. And I wouldn't say it was a movement because it wasn't going on its own. It was pretty much like me planning 10-day events, maybe a couple other things happening. And then starting in 2011, I knew both from talking to God about it. Like God actually told me, "Hey, this is where you're at, basically." And so I had a sense from the Lord, but then also in the way you can look at it. That event we did in 2011 started this next season of growth. Where now this last year we saw over 400 locations doing 10 days events. And so, yeah, really that 2011 point, that was the point where it was like, okay, from here on, I understand this is going to be a new season of development and growth.
Incredible. The official number is that there were 400, over 400 10-day events in 2023.
Yes, yes.
Amazing. Wow. Did you ever think that would be possible, Jonathan?
You know, I yeah, I think that's the funny thing is when I had the vision, of course, I'm thinking like this is going to happen very quickly,
Hmm.
and happen right away. So I was like, this seems impossible, but God is saying it, and so I believe it's possible. And so then I'm thinking this will happen right away. Uh, and then you get into it, you realize it's not that easy. And now 20 years in, it's like, wow. So I think at this point, it's amazing because um, I've come to understand how difficult it is. Um, and but still, I really do feel God wants to do much more, not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of seasons of encounter for the global church. So I feel like um, in some ways we're just getting started, and that this idea is something that's going to bless many more people and be something that God uses to bring awakening, revival, and prepare His church for the return of Jesus.
Jonathan, your book starts with that vision. And so we're going to dive into that. We're going to tease that apart, this amazing vision that you've alluded to, which has driven the whole story since the beginning. But actually, I want to get to know a few things about you that I didn't learn from the book. And I thought I'd take the opportunity to unpack just a couple things to help us understand who you are as a person and how you enter this story. And so if I can just ask you a few questions, the story opens in Santa Fe. Has Santa Fe always been your hometown?
No, I went to college in Santa Fe. So my undergraduate degree was in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I went to St. John's College, which is a small liberal arts college, but originally from the Midwest, born in Chicago and grew up in Kansas City and St. Louis.
And do I understand rightly that your dad is a pastor? You allude to that in the book, but we don't really get the details there.
Yep, my dad is a pastor, and actually my grandfathers, going back a number of generations, were pastors. Come from a pastoring family.
And when was the first time in your life that you thought, yeah, maybe I'm going to do something like being a pastor or work in religious work?
Yeah, so I did not know what I wanted to be when I grew up, but I knew what I didn't want to be, and that was anything pastoral, anything in ministry. That was so I really didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew that's what I didn't want to do. And so God really surprised me, kind of came after me. So, it really was a calling because it was the furthest thing from my own personal desires to do that. And I was actually surprised. I remember telling the Lord, like, I can't believe I'm saying yes to this and I'm even liking it, because that would be, like, I don't really like broccoli. That would be like if you told me, you're going to really love broccoli someday. You're going to make it every day on purpose. I'd be like, no, I won't ever do that. And this was basically what the Lord, this trick He pulled on me. I do think there's something to God's calling on families, and that's mysterious, because it does seem to be something that's been happening in my family for many years, many generations.
What did you study in college?
So I was a philosophy major. And that's one way to put it. It was called liberal arts, but basically St. John's is a great books college. So we read a lot of classic works of Western civilization, kind of start with the Greeks and then move through up until the modern age. And so that was my field of study. I was just really fascinated to learn everything I could about the world. I was fascinated by science, math, philosophy. All of these different topics were just very interesting to me. And so St. John's seemed like a great place to explore all of those.
And if I can ask one more background question. So at the beginning of the book, you were a married man, and you slowly give us glimpses of how your wife, Cassie, has supported you, believed in this mission, sacrificed with you. She must also be an amazing person as yourself. How did you two meet and when did you marry?
Yeah, so we met when I was 16 and she was 17. We were at a Christian summer camp in Colorado, and then we wrote letters for 2 years. I got engaged when I was a senior in high school, um, much to everyone's shock and surprise, to a girl who lived out of town that nobody knew. And then we got married after my freshman year. And so, yeah, kind of not maybe not the normal age range for marriage at this point, but
Brilliant.
that's how it went down. Her dad was a Marine, but she lived in Florida at the time. So
Cool. Well, the glimpses that we get of her in the book reveal that she is really an amazing person. So glad that so glad that you found each other, and that's amazing. Now, I'd like to start with the book here. The book begins with this vision. There is a tiny backstory to this vision that comes, but once the vision is delivered, that's the program we're running with through this text. But You write in the first chapter called Road Trip, and I just want to read a few paragraphs from that part of the book. So this is from the first chapter, Road Trip, 2004, and I'll begin reading at the bottom of page 12. You write, my intention was to devote every waking hour of the 7-day journey to prayer, worship, listening to scripture, and silent solitude. I also plan to spend a few days fasting. To make the trip more interesting, I would avoid the main highways and take the back roads as much as possible. My wife, Cassie, somehow agreed to let me go on this adventure. My hope for this 7-day road trip was summed up in a single prayer. Lord, show me who I am and what you're calling me to do. Years later, the memories are still vivid. As I begin the journey west from St. Louis, the tangible presence of God surrounds me, just as it did on Sunday. As I listen to the scriptures, my heart is captured by messages like John 17:21, let them be one as we are one, and Psalm 133, behold how good and pleasant it is for brothers to dwell in unity together. Could it be God is calling me to a ministry focused on the unity of the church? I wonder. So at that point, then, Jonathan, you enter into a church. God uh, delivers an impression that you should go to a church. I'm trying to figure out where this is again. This is down in
Near Kansas City.
a church that you grew up in, I think, and you describe this large three-paneled painting that's in the back of the church, and you had a desire to see this again. You enter into the church, and as you move away from that experience, you write these words. Could it be that God is answering me? Is he calling me to unite his church through prayer? And at the conclusion of the first chapter here, at the end of this epic road trip, you write this. I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that God was calling me to work for the unity of his church. Jesus' prayer in John 17, let them be one as we are one, was ringing in my ears. I also knew that God was calling me to pursue that unity of the Spirit through prayer. As in the upper room, and as on that very trip, a time of waiting in prayer would precede the outpouring of the Spirit. Expectation for unprecedented global revival and hundreds of millions coming to Jesus filled my heart. And finally, I was convinced that all these elements, extraordinary prayer, supernatural unity, revival, and a great harvest, were all somehow related to what would happen on earth before the Lord's return. My new experiences with God filled me with an expectation for the return of Jesus Christ. In this chapter, you set the stage for this whole story that unfolds, and I wanted our listeners to be able to get a taste of some of that narrative. Take me back into this road trip a little bit. How had you ever done something like this before?
Yeah, so I hadn't done anything like this before, and I was really influenced by one of my friends named Glenn Labar, younger man, maybe even a little younger than me, so probably 19 or 20. And he had just gone on a road trip for 5 or 6 days, driven to North Dakota from St. Louis. And when he came back, he was transformed. And I was like, so what'd you do the whole time? He was just like, I prayed and I listened to the Bible. And I'm like, okay. So I had that picture in my mind of this really helped my friend. This was, and that kind of made me jealous, made me, in a good way, made me hungry to try something. And so as I'm coming to the conclusion of my college years and I'm needing to make some of these decisions about what's next, um, that idea was just in my mind like, okay, I didn't come from a background of really an emphasis on hearing from God or prophecy or the voice of God speaking to you. So I was just sort of like feeling it out as best I could. I didn't
Mhm.
I didn't know how it's like, how does this work? How do you open this hailing channel with the divine? And so I was just experimenting. Um, and yeah, it did work, but it also had these unexpected elements where it wasn't just a straight line. It was actually much more difficult than I had anticipated it would be.
Your parents or your wife ask you any tough questions? You were suggesting to them that you were about to do this. Did this seem like a logical thing to do from their point of view?
Yeah, I can't remember exactly what Cassie and I talked about. Um, I know it was a long absence for her, and so like when I got back, she was really relieved to have me back. It was definitely a challenge. My parents were happy about it because I came and actually visited them in the midst of it. So, they were happy to see me. I was actually there for my dad's 50th birthday as a surprise, which was great. Um, but yeah, it was. I think um, because it was my spring break, so leaving Cassie kind of at school while I traveled um, for over a week. That was a difficult thing for her. Once again, she was on board, and yep,
Let's transition for a moment, moving on to chapter 3, the 10 days vision. Still in 2004, you receive this vision from God that really animates the whole rest of the book, and I think really the whole rest of your ministry and your life thus far. So you describe it, but would you be willing to give us that part of the story again?
sure.
What happens in this vision?
Yeah, I basically, um, I'm starting to hear from God. I'm still figuring it out, very much figuring it out. And I had been exposed to a number of um, folks from a non-Western context who are following Jesus. And what I'm learning from them is basically they take the Bible like pretty literally, and they do things that they've like, if they see things happen in the Bible, they don't assume, well, that was then, they just do it. And so I'm reading Daniel chapter 10. I'm wondering, like, God, I need to hear from you. What's next? How do I find out what's next? Like, once again, how do I hear from God? Like, is this seems like something he wants to do, but I don't know how to do it. And so I'm reading Daniel 10, talks about a 21-day fast of a certain kind, and then an angel comes and speaks to him and tells him about the end time. So I'm like, well, this is in the Bible. I'm going to give this a shot. It was just that simple, that naive. Let's try this thing in the Bible. And yeah, so the fast was actually very difficult, actually kind of similar to the fast in Daniel 10, where there was a lot of perseverance that was required to get through it. And it didn't feel like God was close. In fact, as soon as I started it, my experience went from feeling like God is very close to feeling like God was very far away. And so I just had to kind of like slug through. Prayer times weren't enjoyable, more like God showing me my sin, if anything, it was all kind of bad. And yeah, anyway, I get to the end of the season and I'm not convinced God is going to speak to me at all, but I have some anticipation. And yeah, the Lord does speak to me. He starts speaking to me that he's calling me to be a forerunner, someone who goes before someone greater to prepare the way. And he gives me some biblical examples of that ministry, which is very interesting. I hadn't ever heard anything like that before, other than from the Bible. Just fast forward 4 or 5 years later, I get exposed to the International House of Prayer in Kansas City, and I find out their whole ministry is based around this idea of forerunning. And I go on their website; everything is called Forerunner, and I was actually kind of embarrassed because this for me was like a secret I had with God, that this was what he'd called me to do, and they were like kind of like blasting it. It was a little bit, it was a little bit overwhelming. And But that was very confirming. It was like, wow, okay, this is not just something God's speaking to me; He's speaking it to other people. And and then yeah, the main part of the experience took place about 2 or 3 hours after that.
Hmm.
Um, God spoke this phrase to me: Babylon refuses to mourn, which was very out of the blue. I heard it just in my mind. It wasn't like an external voice, but it was like accompanied by a very strong sense of God's presence. I knew it was the Lord. And I said back to him, but your people will mourn before you return. And so it's this real clear sense, all this is a reference to Revelation chapter 18. Um, and then he showed me uh, this 10-day time period from the Day of Trumpets to the Day of Atonement, or Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur. He said, call my people to 10 days of fasting, mourning, and repentance. Um, and there were various elements, but maybe the heart of it was I saw a city that had stopped everything for 10 days. And people weren't going to work or school or shopping. People were just seeking the face of God. And it was as if um, the throne room in heaven in Revelation 4 and 5 was on earth in this city. It was incredibly beautiful. I knew this place would never be the same. And I asked God, you know, how would you respond if a city sought you in this way? By the way, we don't have to talk about this, but that's actually a biblical question that comes up a lot in the prophets in different language. And so that question that's coming out of me was really, in hindsight, very biblical question. And then my second question was, is this how you want to answer Jesus' prayer in John 17? So that was the heart of the vision. He had also given me to understand this was supposed to be a national and uh, global thing that he wanted to do. And so that was the experience and the vision that kind of changed my life and set me on the course that I'm still pursuing now, 20 years later.
Amazing. And as we said at the beginning of the call, there's been over 400 10-day gatherings in 2023. Absolutely amazing that could explode to such a degree.
Right. Yeah. And once again, I was thinking at the time, this whole thing will unfold in a year. So
Okay.
that
God's
was
timing is
that was
perfect.
my expectation. Yeah. I'm like, wow, this is a lot to do in a year, but here we go. With God, all
Okay.
things are possible. That was my mindset.
Absolutely amazing. God delivers the plan, and he also delivers the resource and the stamina and the perseverance to bring that together. That's truly an amazing story. If I can ask one question before we close this chapter on the interview, and that is, many threads in the book are brought to full resolution. This vision that you've described here does come to fruition in the book. There's one part of the subplot really that, as far as I could tell, didn't come to resolution, and that is your relation with the property of D.L. Moody in Northfield, the campus that he built there. You express at different times in the book a strong conviction that God has a plan for that property and that you're involved in that plan. Can I just ask what is what's the current state of that relationship, and how do you see that God might continue to fulfill that vision?
Well, yeah. One of the themes of the book that I wanted to put in, and um, I'd say the biggest motivation in my heart in writing the book was towards next generation leaders. And it was almost like from my heart, hey, here are some of the challenges that you might face. Here are some of the disappointments you might encounter. And things, it's sort of like things I wish I had known. And so in the story, this there's a real supernatural connection to a place which is where the student volunteer mission movement started. It's where Dale Moody's buried, called Northfield. And basically, like, we see God's faithfulness in bringing us there, connecting us there. It's the first place we really have a successful 10 days meeting. And then God brings it back around and actually uses us to reopen the property in a new way. It's like pretty amazing. At the height of it, we have a house of prayer in D.L. Moody's house. So
Wow.
it's like after 10 years of this crazy faith journey that makes no sense, I moved my entire family pursuing this thing. And so it seems like it's all coming together, it's all happening. And then essentially it all falls apart. And I don't understand why. It doesn't make sense with what God's saying. And in some ways, it still doesn't make sense to me. And so that's why that thread is sort of unresolved, because I think for me personally, it's a little bit still unresolved. And the reason it's like, well, why would you introduce an element like that into a story? What it's better to have things resolve. And for me, the reason to introduce that was just to say, you may have things like this in your life that make no sense, and that you clearly saw God working in these ways, and then it doesn't make sense. And that might just be part of what it means to be living in this age, in this era. And it might be part of what you encounter. So I wanted to, I wanted to give people maybe more tools. And then I think what I do try to show is how God uses this really painful, uh, totally confusing. And I tried to communicate how confused I was and how, just how difficult it was to go through. That God uses even these things and then brings incredible fruitfulness out of it. And so for me, I'd say the explosion in the numbers of people doing 10 days came after that incredibly painful loss, that made no sense to me from what God had spoken. And in terms of the future of Northfield, right now, I'm not involved there. Um, although I do live near there, and we occasionally will host an event at a location close by. And I'm open handed about it. Whatever God wants to do is fine with me. But we'll just see. There may be more to the story still there, but I felt like it was important to share, kind of like the warts and all. You can't really. It's undeniable God led us there. It's undeniable God has done incredible things. It's also undeniable that a lot of that fell apart. And so you're just like, I don't understand, but I'm still going to follow Jesus. And, I'm still going to, I'm going to get over some of these pains and then figure out what it means to follow him into the next season, take the next steps. And ultimately, that's what the faithfulness of God looks like to us. It doesn't always feel in the moment like, wow, God is being faithful. And yet he is being faithful, and we need to move through those experiences that are confusing and difficult, much like the crucifixion was, confusing and difficult, or so many other instances we can think of, that people in the Bible lived through.